So our guests today represent universities, law firms, the media, kind of centers of activity for crucial strengthening and sustaining a strong democracy. I'm not going to spend a lot of time introducing each one of them because Nira did that. Jim Acosta, formerly with CNN, White House correspondent, weekend anchor, is now on Substack doing independent journalism. Dean Traynor at Georgetown was one of the first to stand up, and we'll talk about that, as we all know how universities are under attack these days. And my old friend Abby Lowell, who has been in I can't tell you how many wars involving administrative and government officials from a legal standpoint. But Abby left his law firm fairly recently and is representing any number of organizations whose funding has been cut off, and most notably the New York Attorney General Letitia James, who has been is now the target of a criminal investigation simply because she had the temerity of bringing a civil suit against Donald Trump over the course of her career. So I want to talk a little bit about where we are and get each one of these individuals to talk about their particular areas where they have seen that we can move and where we can't. Each of them have taken courageous stands, and I'm going to get Jim. I think I'm going to begin with you because as an anchor, many have said over the years that you took courageous stands. You said the things that needed to be said. Knowing you, I think you'll say, I was doing my job. And I agree with that, by the way. But you've spoken out publicly a lot against this administration, going back to the first administration. Got denied access to the White House press room. You've been the target of countless Trump social media posts. Received a few death threats, I would imagine, which in light of the weekend's activities puts us all on high alert. So did it ever cross your mind that this might be the result, the ramifications of you doing your job in the way that you believed, in the way you were trained? Did it cross your mind that you would receive these kind of death threats? What was going on, and did you prepare your family and others for the blowback and the reaction that you've seen?
First of all, thanks for having me here. And of course, you called on me first to pick on the media, right?
Of course.
It's a proud tradition now in American politics.
Former politicians and current ones always do that,
yeah,
right?
No, there was a nice time when we got it from both sides in equal measure, not so much anymore. But no, thanks for having me here. I appreciate it. No, listen, I do think, and not that anybody, feels very sorry for the press. I tell people all the time, if you want to be liked, go be a veterinarian, don't be a journalist. But no, there's no question about it. Our profession is under attack. I've been saying, ever since he came down the golden plated escalator back in 2015, that he represents a threat to the free press in this country. And, back on the campaign trail back in 2016, he would call us liars and scum and thieves and so on, and eventually called us fake news and the enemy of the people. And Doug, I think you and I were talking backstage. I mean, one of the issues, and this, takes us back to what took place in Minnesota over the weekend, when the president of the United States uses that kind of superheated rhetoric, you have to imagine that there's going to be consequences for it. That he might say, oh, how can you blame me for this? But what I've encountered out on the campaign trail is you see his supporters absorb these kinds of attacks, absorb this kind of rhetoric, and then direct it back at the press or direct it back at whichever segment of American society he's going after in ways that can be downright dangerous. And we've seen that happen with the press. My sense of it is that, he has cracked the code in how to harm the news media in this country. I don't know if we're going to talk about some of the lawsuits and so on later on in this program, but when the president of the United States is filing bogus defamation lawsuits against major brand name news organizations, he is figuring out a way to harm the press, in part because these major news organizations are run by giant corporations that are allowing it to happen. And I think we just have to be very clear about this, what's happening in this country right now. ABC and settling that defamation lawsuit against George Stephanopoulos, a lawsuit that did not have any merit. sent a signal to the White House that these kinds of tactics can work. And so now he's trying to do the same thing to CBS. There was some information out there, I think, in the Wall Street Journal in the last couple of weeks that the people at Paramount were offering $15 million and Trump wanted $25 million and an apology. And so, it just goes to show you, when you do these sorts of things, when you try to cut these kinds of deals, when you put your corporate interests ahead of the country's interests, it encourages bad behavior. And so, there's just an overarching, I think, line of attack that he has these days. And honestly, what I went through during the first Trump administration, that was directed at my news organization to some extent, but it was really directed at me. They kicked me out of the White House. They took away my press pass. Now they are going after whole news organizations. They're going after the Associated Press, kicking them off of Air Force One, kicking them out of the Oval Office. And what did we see from the White House Correspondents Association? Not much of a resistance. Some strongly worded letters, that sort of a thing. I had been encouraging them to take more concerted action. Don't cover him on these trips. Don't send the photographers, these beloved photographers, into the press cabin on Air Force One. That to me would get his attention. So there's a whole host of things that he's doing in terms of going after the press. The death threat part of this is just one part of it. But the problem is, and we could talk about this during the course of this program, and this I think applies to the universities and to the law firms in this country, when key institutions in America bend the knee and bow down, it just keeps the behavior going. It sets an incentive structure for the most powerful person on earth.
Absolutely. Thanks. Dean, let's talk about universities, and particularly back in February, Georgetown got a letter from then acting U.S. Attorney Ed Martin, who is since no longer in that office, has moved over to Maine Justice, but sent Georgetown a somewhat threatening letter. It said that they would refuse to consider any applicant for employment from Georgetown who is a student or affiliated with a law school or university that continues to teach and utilize diversity, equity, and inclusion. And if kind of threatened Georgetown that you needed to eliminate all of those, you sent a pretty strongly worded letter. Now you are a constitutional scholar, recognized as a constitutional scholar, immediately saw that there were real problems with that. But you push back on that. Has there been any repercussions? But tell us a little bit about the thinking at the school, if you can, without divulging confidential things, but about what went on, because it had to be more than just your decision to send that letter, because it affected the whole school.
Right. So I have to say, actually, when I first got the letter, my first reaction was that it had to be a hoax. Because, partly when I got the letter, it has the seal of the U.S. Attorney. He was interim U.S. Attorney. And then I thought, a prosecutor can't be threatening a law school over its curriculum. So, I thought this can't be legitimate. And I was right about to call Georgetown as a threat assessments person, which I think gives you a sense of what kind of time we live in. And I was about to call that person to say, can you hack into a DOJ email account? So it looks like it's coming from a DOJ email account. But then I was convinced that it, was in fact legitimate, that it in fact came from the interim U.S. Attorney. And it really struck me at two dimensions as really at odds, really attacking our ability to function as a law school. The Supreme Court is absolutely clear that a university has a right to determine what its curriculum is. The case law is well established and goes back to actually a Frankfurter opinion 60 years ago. So that was just clear as a constitutional law matter that nobody in the administration can tell you what to teach, and certainly not a prosecutor. And then Georgetown is a Catholic and Jesuit university. And our mission is about making sure that all the voices in the room are heard and that we learn from the dialogue when everybody gets a chance to speak. And again, that a prosecutor doesn't get to tell you that you can't follow your mission. And so it was both, free expression, but it also was at odds with our ability to carry out our mission as a religious law school, religious university. So So it just, it was just, this is not something where you negotiate. It was just clearly an assault on constitutional rights. And so, in terms of, next steps, when you do something like this in a university context, you don't do it alone. So you have to, first of all, I talked with my internal law school administration, and then I talked with, the university hierarchy, and they all have to approve it, both at the board level and the president. It has to, something like this, a law school dean can't act alone. And then I wrote the letter working with the general counsel's office, and I read it to my wife, because, she had to be on board with this. And she also actually has a better sense of rhetoric than I do. So I read it to her, and I said, first of all, are you comfortable with me sending this? And she said, I am. This is clearly the right thing to do. And she said, I do have one suggestion. Call him interim U.S. attorney. And she said, and do it several times. And so one of the things that has been very striking to me is that people will say to me, love the letter. They briefly will talk about the constitutional argument, the Jesuit mission, Catholic mission, say, but what I really liked was the way you called him interim U.S. attorney. So I have to give kudos to my wife about that. But the thing that was very striking to me is whenever you take a hard decision, I'm used to getting, there's people, you never get everybody to agree with you. You can get attacked from the left or the right or sometimes both. And one of the things that, I've done this for a very long time, one of the things that my associate deans will say is, how can you be a dean for so long when, you're always inevitably at the center of controversial issues? And one thing I say is, I never read social media because, I don't want to, people agree with me, people disagree with me, but I would prefer not to kind of have that sense because I know it's out there. So, I wrote the letter, and stunningly, every response I've gotten has been positive. From the right and from the left, from around the world. A dean in Singapore sent me a note, somebody at Oxford sent me a note saying, this is absolutely the right thing to do. But again, it's, right and left. And last week, for example, it was remarkable. I got a petition that was organized by a Christian group that was signed by more than 18,000 people expressing support for what I'd done. More than 18,000 and 400 pages of comments. So, I think as we're confronting all of the difficult stances, all the difficult issues that we have, I was just very struck by the uniformly positive response. And so one of my associate deans came to me and said, you can actually read the social media this time.
Thanks. Look, and as someone I can tell you, I love the letter. But as a former U.S. attorney who was nominated and confirmed by the Senate, your wife was spot on. Abby, speaking of government and criminal cases and pushing back, you've done it a lot in your career over the years. Not always from a political standpoint, but sometimes even in routine criminal cases, government overreaches. There's issues that you've got as a defense lawyer got to push back on. You have represented Republicans, you've represented Democrats against administrations of both parties. Recently, you left a big law firm to form your own practice. And that practice is, I'm sure you will do a lot of different things, but it seems to me that what you're kind of doing, focusing on right now, is defending people who have been the targets of some administration actions, whether it's Letitia James in New York, whether it's folks that are having their funding pulled. So I'm curious, was this a risky move to do this? What went into your thinking about starting a firm? I can tell you folks, starting a new law firm is not an easy business these days. Tell me your thinking and knowing that you also can be the target of this because individual lawyers have been the targets as well.
Wow. So I think I start that question by saying, in deference to my colleague to my left, in terms of what went into the discussion, I too had to consult with my spouse about it. Actually, what was the catalyst? Was I was in a large law firm doing what I wanted to do pretty much for years. And then the world changed. And law firms were put in this very difficult position to worry about whether if they did something, it was going to affect something else, which was not the calculus in law firms' decisions to represent clients in the past. So you could sue an agency in the past without thinking that there would be retribution to a client that had an application or license pending at that same agency. The fundamental premise of my doing what I did is reflected by what's on the stage. When the founders figured out a way to check the power of government, it knew that there should be 3 co-equal branches, but it also had 2 other things working. One was the media, and the other was the rule of law. Lawyers have played a fundamental role in preserving things from the very beginning of our country, and people will know that I've said this before. People need to remember that John Adams represented the British soldiers in the Boston Massacre and went on to be president of the United States. Lawyers have that function. When it turned out that I was going to put my law firm at harm's way by taking on the cases I would normally take and cause them or their clients, I had a choice. Either stay there, be quiet and silent, sit on my hands, and anybody who knows me probably knows that that's probably not in my DNA, or do something. And the something became pretty obvious, which was I couldn't do it there, so I had to do it someplace. I was really lucky that people that had the same view had already started to take actions to leave their firms. My first 2 hires were the first 2 people I talked to about hiring were the 2 brave associates at Skadden Arps that left in a huff after Skadden made its deal. And then the others that have come along have been in similar situations. So to answer your question in a succinct way, I had that choice and I didn't really have a choice. I mean, people saying, wow, it was really great that you did this. My answer back, without trying to be overly humble, is, you know how like little sea turtles that hatch on the beach have an instinctive path into the water? I don't feel like I did anything that wasn't my instinctive path back to a water in which I'm comfortable. So that was one answer. As to the targeting, I have challenged government overreach in every administration since Ronald Reagan. The difference now is that there's so much overreaching over so many different areas that there's just more to do. But it's not like what I and my colleagues are doing are different than my practice, pardon me, for however long. In terms of the risks involved, because of what you said, Doug, I've represented people in high-profile matters on both sides of the aisle, and some people that are not necessarily political clients, but are also high-profile that creates public outrage or furor. So I have gotten risk attacks, threats, terrible, hateful mail in the days in which it was snail mail to the days in which it's now email, all the time. And so it's not something you get used to. Again, the difference is I am used to people in the country thinking if I represent President Trump's kids, that's bad because, after all, aren't you a Democrat? Or when I represent President Biden's son, aren't you terrible because these people are Republicans? What I don't think any of us are used to is being threatened by the President of the United States himself. So I think that's the answer.
And I'm going to stay with you for just a second. We'll kind of work backwards a little bit. Initially, when executive orders were started flooding involving lawyers and law firms, it seemed like lawyers and law firms were capitulating. They would cut a deal, they would do this, that. A lot of lawyers were up in arms. But you correct me if I'm wrong, but my perception right now is that all of a sudden lawyers, law firms, the American Bar Association filed a lawsuit yesterday, are beginning to push back and say no, and standing up, and they seem to be winning. The Perkins Coie firm has won. I think I think 4 have actually won. Do you see that happening around where lawyers, the International Academy of Trial Lawyers, along with the ABA and others, have issued very strong statements?
I see two things. I see first and foremost that I'm not sure that the administration, including the president, thought he was going to win this battle legally. Doesn't mean that they don't do it, because it has an impact on people who don't want to take even the slightest risk, whether it's their bottom line or their client's bottom line. Notice that there's not a lot of appeals going on of these injunctions that have been granted by 4 different judges, some of whom have been, appointed by Republican presidents. So in terms of whether they're going to be new ones, maybe they, to use the expression, blew their wad. Luckily, 4 firms to begin with, and you mentioned Perkins, and there's the Sussman firm, and there's also Wilmer, and there's also Jenner, decided to push back and showed the rest of the country's lawyers what could happen. And I think that has also had an empowering effect for lawyers to do what they're doing. The last piece is, nevertheless, even these law firms that are pushing back, or the government not going after them, still puts these law firms in a very difficult position as to how far they can go in attacking or challenging the government without risking the goodwill of their other clients, which again is why we started this firm. I don't have to worry about my taking on a battle in which another client is hoping that their EPA license will be approved.
Jim, from a journalist standpoint, we have seen not just the lawsuits against major networks, but we have seen individual journalists either leave because of editorial policies, for instance, changes at the Washington Post. There was a whole slew of folks that just up and left. We have seen some journalists get fired because of comments that they made. How is someone working in what I call mainstream or legacy media, as opposed to the independent journalism that you're doing and others are doing now on Substack and other things? How do those journalists, how can they navigate in the world that we're living in now, knowing that sometimes to do your job, you've got to say things that is really going to piss some people off at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue?
Yeah, I'm imagining piranha-infested waters, I think is the visual I would draw, maybe with some landmines or some mines laid in there as well. No, I mean, I think, listen, one of the problems that we have right now is we have sort of an outdated and outmoded corporate media governance structure in this country. I've said at a lot of different events that I've spoken to recently that we sort of need kind of a sea change in terms of how we deliver the news, how we deliver information to the American people right now. I mean, look at what's happening with these major companies that own these news organizations. They are essentially, showing to the President of the United States that they can be manipulated. They can be put over a barrel. And some of these news organizations, their parent companies, are willing to essentially pay bribes to the President of the United States to get the heat off. The American people understand this, and they can see it. They can sniff it out. That's why they've come to places like Substack and YouTube and other independent media sources, the Midas Touch, My Thing, Terry Moran just came over to Substack, you name it. And I think part of that is because it's sort of what we saw over the weekend with the No Kings protests. There's just this hunger and there's this craving for a reset in this country and just sort of a new paradigm shift in terms of how things are done in terms of getting information out to the American people. One of the things that the other thing that you've seen, and it doesn't get as much coverage because, as Abby said, we're sort of all sipping from a busted fire hydrant right now. Look at the way Trump has gone after PBS and NPR. In no way in the United States of America should public broadcasting be subject to the whims of somebody who just wants to be a dictator in this country. Public broadcasting should be separate and secure from those kinds of rantings and ravings. And one of the things that I think we should see in this country is sort of a departure from corporations running these big news organizations, and I think a real investment made in public broadcasting. I'd love to see PBS and NPR sort of be too big to fail in this country and sort of be like the BBC or be like what we see with Canadian broadcasting. I think that if you could see Democrats, progressives, folks in the center, maybe center right, make those sorts of investments down the road, you can, I think, protect the way people receive information in this country. Because right now, folks are just, you live in the heartland, you live in certain parts of the country where your NPR station might be under attack, your PBS station's getting underfunded, or your broadcast stations are being threatened by the White House. Where the hell do they get information in this country right now? I mean, this whole thing needs to be rebuilt, in my estimation, and it has to be done quickly because a lot of folks are just being left to the sort of Joe Rogans and Fox News and the other folks on the far right, and what they control right now in terms of their media presence. And we forget the old days where people would describe the liberal media and so on. In many ways, it is a media that is in large part under the influence of the right in this country because of the way Trump has his thumb on these corporations and the way public broadcasting has been sort of taken apart. Not to mention what's happened over at the Washington Post and the big newspapers. I mean, you really need a big change in this country in terms of how we get information to people.
Oh, just one sentence, because it fits with what he just said and what you asked me about. So one of the clients that we have now, never would have thought this could happen. So we represent freedom of the press organizations who are shareholders of the parent company of CBS, Paramount. And it got publicity, so I'm not revealing something that's not out there. On their behalf, we sent a letter 2 weeks ago to Paramount. When would I ever do that? Send a letter to a parent company of a media organization telling them if they make this deal with Trump, which is completely frivolous and without any merit, our clients are going to bring a lawsuit against them for having diminished the value of their stock. So you have to fight fire sometimes with the same weapons that are used against them. If the bottom line is what's driving this, then the bottom line is what's going to prevent it.
I agree with that to some extent, but I mean, we've seen Trump play the legal system in this country like a violin. And one of the things that he's been able to do is, as we saw in the criminal courts before he was reelected, I mean, they know how to drag things out better than anybody. I think what you need is sort of a rebuilding of the media infrastructure in this country. You cannot, now that we have a situation where the media has been exposed as being subject to these kinds of whims and ridiculous lawsuits, I mean, I don't think any media company is safe right now because of this.
Dean, since you wrote your letter back in February, we have seen other universities get in the crosshairs. Columbia, Harvard, you can just name a lot of. A lot of this seems to be under what I think is just the guise of fighting anti-Semitism, which we all, I think, in this room and online and across this country agree is a huge problem right now. It's a growing problem right now. And that's maybe for another discussion at some point at CAP. But it just seems to me that that is just a ruse to attack universities that the president doesn't like, somebody doesn't like, attack the elite, attack the liberal teachings. What are you seeing happening out there? Are there discussions in academia about how best to stand up and to ensure the academic freedom that this country has enjoyed for so long?
So there are definitely discussions in academia because we all realize it's crucial to stand up. What we see under threat is the ability to do what universities are supposed to do, which is be places of the free exchange of ideas. And I think one thing that we also see, which I think goes back to something that you're talking about, Abby, is the importance of standing together and kind of building coalitions. So, for example, there was a letter from presidents of universities in support of Harvard. And ultimately, it was, I believe, 200 university presidents signed on. But when I talked to people, there was at the very start, what university presidents were saying is, why should I sign on? Why should I stand out? And so it was very hard to get it launched. But then once it got to be 100, then people were saying, I want to sign on because I don't want to stand out, right? So, I think with so many of these things, there really is a tipping point, and building the coalitions and supporting each other and supporting the values is absolutely crucial. But, at the same time, there are real risks. We don't know what's going to happen to Harvard. I mean, I think they're going to win all of the individual cases. But what we're also seeing is with so many of these actions against, whether it's a law firm or universities or press, there's immediate harm. So even if you ultimately win in court, you've lost clients. Maybe the firm goes under. The idea that Harvard may not continue is something that would have been inconceivable. So, but now I think that's something that they're grappling with. But at the same time, I think it's absolutely crucial to think, how do you protect democracy? And you accept risks, but the stakes could not be higher.
All right, before we go to audience questions, which we're going to go to in just a second, I'd like for each of you to take off your respective media, legal, academic hat and just talk to folks out there about how people in this country can respond to what they see, whether it is affecting them directly or not. What is it that Americans in their daily lives can do to either call attention to what's happening or to push back? Dean?
Well, I think one thing that I hear a lot when I talk to people is we don't have a blueprint. This is a challenge that we've never faced before. So if there's a roadmap on how you fight back, I don't know what it is. But I think one thing is, when you find yourself challenged, do the right thing. So, that's what I tried to do. I think that's what Harvard is trying to do. I think that's what the 4 law firms are trying to do. Jim, it's what you tried to do. When the situation comes up, you do the right thing. And, you can't anticipate it. It reminds me when JFK was running for president, and he first became famous because the PT-109 was shelled and he saved his crew. And people said to him, did you always think you'd be a hero? And he said, I didn't intend to be a hero. They sank my boat. And so that's what we're really seeing now, that there's situations in which there are individual challenges and you have to respond to the individual challenge. I would say 2 other things. Thinking about the power of collective action is crucial, whether it's universities responding to the Harvard challenge, but also what we saw this last weekend with people across the country kind of standing forward. I think that was very, very powerful. And I think that's something that, I think that we should be thinking about. And then elections. Elections matter. So thinking about kind of what the electoral process is and being part of that. That I think is the 3rd leg.
Abby?
Let me echo that. I'm asked, because I did what I have done in the last 6 or 7 weeks. People say, why did you do this or whatever? And then people have also asked, as you have, what can everybody do? And I think I thought about that, and I don't think it's that complicated, and I think it echoes what you said. Thing is, everybody can do something. Jim Acosta can get on the air and talk to a lot of people and explain the truth. Dean Traynor can train a whole generation of lawyers to spend part of their lives in public interest or not to be afraid. I can represent individual clients or entities and push back. Okay, I get that. But everybody can do something. So somebody could say, I've had it and I'm going to be one of the people that are peacefully demonstrating in No Kings, and something they would have never done before, they go out and do that. A person can say, I am going to make sure that not only do I vote, but all the people in my family vote. A person can say, I've never given a political contribution or a contribution to a First Amendment cause or for something else, and they can take that $10 or $15 or $25 and do that. I believe that our country is based on individual action, as the Dean and others have said. What I think this is a moment to meet the moment is that everybody has to, in their own way and their own lives, their own professions and their own ability, figure out, what can I do today? And if they do that, we will change what's going on.
Jim?
Well, I would echo both of these gentlemen right here. I absolutely agree with all of that. I mean, I do think to some extent, people have to just start thinking bigger in this country. And they have to look at what we're up against. I've been sort of trying to shout this from the rooftops or wherever anybody will listen to me, at the end of a bar in Kansas City, whatever. The President of the United States is a danger to this country, full stop. And I think what we saw over the weekend with the No Kings protests is a mobilization, but to some extent, a recognition that that is the case. And I think you're starting to see some of this reflected in the polling. Even people in the Republican Party were afraid to show up at his birthday parade, the dictator Kim Jong-un birthday parade that he tried to have over the weekend, where you saw the video of the tank going by the empty stands, and you heard the squeaking of the tracks of the tank, and it was sort of like, what is this? And so, I think the other thing is folks have to have hope. You have to have hope that we're going to get through this. If hundreds of thousands of millions of people had shown up and cheered on Trump as those tanks were rolling down Constitution Avenue, then maybe I'd be a little bit more worried today. But what I saw over the weekend was the millions upon millions of people who are opposed to what he's trying to do to American society showing up in almost every town and community in this country. That was a very powerful thing. And so to some extent, we just have to, and I said this when I signed off from my job at CNN. I said, you don't want to give in to the lies, you don't want to give in to fear, but you have to hold on to hope. And as Pollyannish and as cheesy and quaint as that sounds maybe to the young people, I think some of us who are longer in the tooth understand that all too well. And one of the images that I took away from this past weekend that really stayed with me were those military veterans. There were some of these military veterans who had fought in World War II and said, we defeated fascism the last time, I'm here to do it this time. I don't know if anybody saw those images, but they were very stirring images, I thought. And so to some extent, I think we have to have a little bit of faith in each other that we can get through this.
All right. So we're going to open this up now. I appreciate the panelists and their comments, and we're going to open this up to some questions. We'll do, if anybody's got one here in the audience first. Yep, toward the back.
Great. Thank you very much. So I'm Jeff Wheeler. I teach a class at Georgetown, the School of Foreign Service, and I head up a project that's being canceled by DOJ. So I agree with the importance of fighting, resisting, defending, but I'd like to pick up on a point that Jim Acosta made, which is we need a new paradigm, and I'm wondering how we get there, both in the way that the media conveys information analysis to the public, but also in the way that those of us who've worked for the government explain what the government does in ways and in means that make sense and resonates with people. So I'm wondering, as we move from a more reactive, defensive posture to a more proactive vision, how do we get there, particularly media, governance as well? Thank you.
Anybody?
And I'll be brief because I know I sometimes talk too long. I do think that, in my lifetime, I grew up in Virginia. I went to school at James Madison, not too far from here. And I remember some of the first talk radio I ever heard in my life was Rush Limbaugh. And, to me, it seems over the last generation or so, the far right in this country has kind of figured out a way to infiltrate, the heartland and to, basically pull, mom and pop from the farm to their point of view. And as it turns out, a lot of those folks vote in these elections. And a lot of those folks have been completely led astray. I hate to say it, but they've just been completely led astray. And we've all just let this happen on our watch with essentially a business model for delivering the news in this country that just does not work anymore. And perhaps it was the deregulation that happened during the Reagan administration. I don't know. I don't know what you could put your finger on it, I suppose, if you were to do a long dissertation on it. But the way we deliver information to people in this country has to change. And you cannot have the world's richest people gobbling up newspapers, slashing staffs. One of the things I didn't even mention during all of this is I can guarantee you in almost every newsroom in this country, there is job fear. And so when the editorial people at those news organizations and the people who own those news organizations are getting pressure from the administration, the people in those newsrooms feel it every day. We have got to come up with a different way of paying journalists in this country to do their jobs so people can get reliable, truthful, honest information. If we don't do that, forget about building high-speed rails. They're never going to get built because nobody's ever going to understand what the point is of having high-speed rail in this country. So it has to start with how people get information, in my opinion. And I think that's what I was saying earlier. You've got to start, the folks on the left and the center who care about democracy, you've got to start thinking about bigger ideas that get people's attention. Because otherwise, just sort of nibbling around the edges and let's just go get this person who might get elected and maybe they've got some good ideas. It's just not going to work. It's just not going to work.
And Jim, I want to add one thing, because you use the word information several times as opposed to news. I think in today's world where we've lost so much of the local newspapers and the local news, that's where people used to get their information, local news. We don't have that, but they're still getting information.
Yes.
It's just not always news. It's just done in a different way. And that's part of that change that we've just got to adapt to get information to people that's accurate.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that's why independent media is so important, not to monopolize the time, but I think that's why people are gravitating in those directions.
But I think we're really talking about two tracks. So one is what we're focusing on now, which is what do you do immediately? How do you respond to the challenges to democracy that we're seeing in so many areas? And I have to say, I both emphasize the grounds for concern and that what a powerful threat it is, but I also have hope. So I mean, those are the two things that I convey. But then I think we also have to think about the longer term strategy. How do you make sure that this doesn't happen in 10 years or in 20 years? And I think changing the news media is part of it, but also part of its education. One of the things that struck me very early in the administration when people were saying, like the vice president, we may not follow court orders, a lot of people just didn't care. When law schools were talking about this is the rule of law under threat, there are a lot of issues that have generated a lot of emotion. That wasn't one of them. And so I think that one thing that we have to also do is figure out ways to communicate better why the rule of law matters, why we have democracy, why we have 3 branches of government. So I think that's something that law schools and universities can play a part in, but it's absolutely essential long-term to make sure that after we beat these challenges, that in the long term, we're on the right path.
You want to do another one here or go online, Alice? You want to do another one here?
One in room and then online.
Okay.
Hey, all. I'm Caleb Smith. I'm the Director of LGBT Policy here at the Center for American Progress. Something that feels really scary is just the volume of actions that are anti-democratic are the number of times a day we'll go, well, I guess we just got to sue because there's so few options left. It feels like to hold the administration accountable, just really flying in the face of things like regulatory processes and that the process violations all over the place. I'm curious about litigator fatigue and litigation fatigue. Does it feel like that overwhelm for y'all? And what do we do about that when that's probably part of the strategy?
Abby?
I'll jump into that one. You remember that right after the administration took office, you heard the phrase that their strategy was to flood the zone. Remember that phrase? We're flooding the zone. There are over 250 lawsuits in the United States right now that are challenging actions of this administration. There's probably over 50 temporary restraining orders or preliminary injunctions. I realize those have to be further litigated. They don't have enough bandwidth, enough good lawyers, enough people to be staffing these. So we have done their philosophy in reverse. There are lots of people who, as I started however many months ago, understood that lawyers have a very important role in preserving democracy and the rule of law, and the founders understood this. There's so many people out there that are willing to take up the fight. And so think of it if you're saying, is it fatigue? We have a very large bench of people that are willing to stand up, and they are standing up. One of my favorite analogies in history is the Alamo, in the following way. There was a bunch of very small banded people who put up enough fight to cause the other side to have to spend time there while the rest of the troops were amassing to then meet the victory. I think the lawsuits are that.
Dean, you've got probably an interesting perspective. We were talking about the number of law school applicants at Georgetown this year has skyrocketed, which we believe is in part in response to what people see. You agree?
No, I mean, so we have 14,000 applicants this year. I mean, that's a historic number.
You have to tell them for how many spots. It's ridiculous small.
Yeah, so, it's about, yeah, that's right. No, it's about 600 spots, but 14,000 applicants. And I have to say, I was just talking to the Dean of Admissions. He was saying, like, we may have like a 3.94 median GPA. I mean, it's stunning what that means in terms of, who the acceptance. I didn't have a 3.94. But it's, what we're seeing now, and this is really hope for the future, is that people realize that the rule of law matters. We've gone through a time in which actually law school applications were down because people thought it was about finance or entertainment. What we're seeing now is, and I find it when I talk to admitted students, that they realize that the rule of law matters, that it is central, and that lawyers can make a difference. And so that's, we talk about the hope for the future. For me, that's a crucial part of hope for the future.
And I can tell you, as the personality of those litigators, they may start feeling some fatigue, but then when somebody does something that they don't like, it's like a shot of adrenaline, and they get right back up. And I think that that's true of lawyers and litigators across the country. So we're going to go online, I think, with a question, Alice?
Yes, this is a question from our online audience. What would you say to people who believe that the institutions you represent, universities, legal professionals, and journalists, are somehow harming our country? Acknowledging the need for reform, how do you see these institutions bettering our country?
All right, who wants to go with that one first?
I think the dean does.
I think a crucial element of democracy is, the free exchange of ideas and hearing all the voices and dialogue. So, I think that one thing that, that I'm certainly mindful of is, making sure that there's intellectual diversity and that there's a range of ideologies present both in the faculty and the student body. And, just one thing as an example of what I saw this year is our Federalist Society put together basically weekly programs in which they would have kind of the big issues, the Dobbs case or affirmative action or, challenges to the administrative state. And they would have a liberal and a conservative, and they would debate them. And the classrooms were always full. They were late at night on Wednesday, and the classrooms were packed all through the year. So, I think that it is absolute that the universities can play an essential role, and I think there are things that we can be doing better. But this dialogue occurs very powerfully at universities, and that's why what our mission is so essential. And then I would also say again, to go back to, not all universities are the same. So one of the things that I stressed in my letter is that Georgetown, as a Jesuit and Catholic school, has a mission. And so I think that also contributes to who we are as a society, and that also should be supported.
I think I understand the gist of the question. And the way I interpret it is, if this administration's attack on universities, law firms, or the media also has a shred of, what could we be doing better part, that's fine. But when my car has a flat tire, I fix the tire, I don't take the entire car and smash it into a wall. And so it seems to me that always in our country, when criticisms are raised, and some of it is, okay, could we do media better? Could we do universities better? Can we do law firms or lawyers better? Of course. But that is not what's happening here. It is as if the administration has decided any nick in the tire is going to cause the entire car to be crushed. That's the difference.
Jim?
And I do think that, to some extent you have to be smart. I mean, you have to realize that Donald Trump is a very experienced and shrewd practitioner of laying the bait, of setting the trap. And as we've seen in Los Angeles and with the No Kings protests, I think he was, and with this military parade here in Washington, I think he was very much hoping that he would see an overreaction, a sort of violent response from protesters. So he would sort of open up the floodgates, open up the doors to a really harsh response. And the protesters, the people of this country did not give him that opportunity. They did not take the bait. They did not trip the wire. And I think to some extent, I think some forethought in how to respond to him and his anti-democratic ways, I think that goes a long way as well. I think I took from the gist of that question that the person views each of these institutions as harming America. I think the only way that these institutions can harm the country is by bending the knee and kowtowing and giving him what he wants. If you deny him that fuel, if you deny him that oxygen, you will go a long way towards driving him up a wall. Take it from me.
All right, folks, I know we got other questions. I'm sorry. But we are out of time. I want to thank this extraordinary panelist for their words. And to close us out, for those here, for those watching, whether you are in media, legal, academia, it doesn't matter. I want to go back to something Jim said a moment ago, and it's what he signed off with when he left CNN. Don't give in to the lies. Don't give in to fear. Hold on to the truth and to hope. Thank you all for joining us today.